Hi, this is Michael Mowney, the writer of A Person First. In this video, I'm going to offer a short overview of my diagram of life in modern times. This diagram is part of a series called What Happened Here, which is about explaining and exploring the loss of faith in institutions that is common in liberal democracies like the US. I hope that through this video, I can break down the key ideas in this diagram to help you understand how I see the overall role that institutions play in our personal lives and in liberal societies. Let's get started. Let's begin with the person first. From the moment we are born, we are moving towards some things and away from others. But why do we move? Often is because we desire something or we dislike something. But as children, we often desire things that are bad or dangerous for us, and we dislike things that are good for us. And so we rely on the authorities in our lives, like parents, teachers, and spiritual leaders, to guide us towards safety so we don't die and, in fact, flourish as people. Our authorities might tell us that some things are good and we should desire them, and other things are bad and we should avoid them. And so we start to view the world in terms of good and bad, right and wrong. This is called dualism because it splits the world up into two parts: things that are good and desirable, and things that are bad and not desirable. Because our authorities tell us what is good, we tend to associate good things with our authorities. And because our authorities protect us, we tend to trust them, and we begin to think that what they tell us is absolutely true. We think that what they say is true in all contexts. And we begin to believe that we belong with these authorities, so we build a community that we call us. But then we also recognize that some people are not part of our community, and we might think of them as bad, or at least people not to be trusted. This is helpful because children can be harmed by strangers. But as we get older and experience more of the world around us and the many different people sharing this planet with us, we encounter multiple perspectives on many things, including good and bad. And for many of us, it becomes more difficult to keep seeing the world through dualism. And so we begin to develop a worldview that can help us make sense of the diversity in our world. One way to handle that diversity of perspectives is to adopt the view that truth depends on context. So, for example, in the USA, forest fires were generally viewed as bad in all contexts for many years. This is clear from public service advertisements from the National Forest Service informing the public that only you can prevent forest fires. But in recent years, multiple perspectives have entered the conversation regarding forest fires. According to some authorities, the lack of fires in U.S. forests over many decades contributed to a buildup of foliage. So when forest fires eventually happened, they burned hotter and grew bigger than they would have if forests had experienced more frequent, smaller fires to clear out more foliage. And therefore, some prescribed, controlled forest fires might be good. Eventually, authorities reached consensus that whether forest fires were good or bad depended on context. And this led to the National Forest Service changing the language of their public service campaign to "only you can prevent wildfires." This worldview of seeing truth as dependent on context and that authority is derived by consent is an idea that we might call relativism. That is, truth and authority are relative to context, and what we call good and bad depend on context as well. Many people initially think that relativism is more of a special case and only applies to things like forest fires. But many people eventually begin to see things as relativism is the way things generally are. But this then introduces a new problem. If we think that truth is generally dependent on context, does that mean anything goes? Does this mean you can simply believe and do whatever you want and it's fine? This doesn't seem like a reasonable or workable way to live. In fact, it might even be dangerous. It would imply that things like killing someone are not bad. It just depends on your point of view. From here, people can take different paths of development. One is to retreat into forms of dualism. That is to say that, in fact, we can't adopt relativism generally, and the world really can be divided up into good and bad, right and wrong, us and them. And some people may become dogmatic and claim that they have found the absolute truth about good and bad. Others might go further and think that authorities that they favor should enforce this absolute truth about right and wrong, regardless of whether other people disagree or if there are contextual factors that affect whether something is good or bad. Other people may try to escape from having to make a choice and conclude that relativism means that people will simply just do whatever will serve their own self-interest, or that nothing really matters, or that they can't trust anyone and simply must figure everything out themselves. But many people make a commitment and a choice towards a particular course in their life. They choose a particular set of values and set of practices that let them live their lives in a meaningful way. But people who make a commitment recognize that the values they choose need to be balanced against others, and this helps us solve the anything goes problem. For example, a person might make a commitment to individual liberty as an important value, but they would also recognize that people should not be free to do anything they want, like kill someone, so they balance individual liberty against the need for order and safety in society. A person who has made a commitment to the value that killing is wrong might also recognize that it's not always easy to determine if killing someone is always wrong in all contexts. There are often contexts like self-defense or accidents that help us evaluate what we determine to be wrong or justified. But this now raises the question of, how do people decide what their values and practices will be? Well, to start to answer this question, we can return back to the fact that we desire things that are good. And as we experience more of the world, we start to notice lots of things are good. Abstract things like knowledge, values like happiness and wellness, and concrete things like certain products and services. But because we live in a relativistic world, and we need to balance some values against others, we begin to understand that goods are also dependent on context as well. But what kind of context can help us understand what kinds of things are good? One context we can use to understand and evaluate goods is practices. So, in this video, I'm going to define a practice as an activity that people establish in order to pursue goods, and they achieve these goods by observing standards of excellence for that practice. In other words, a practice is something that you can get good at, but what kinds of things are practices? So, kicking a ball is not a practice because there isn't a set of standards of excellence that people agree on for how to kick a ball well in all contexts. But soccer or football is a practice because it has a set of standards of excellence that people who play soccer generally agree on. Cutting things with a knife, that's not a practice, but cooking is a practice. And telling people what to do is not a practice, but government is a practice. These examples illustrate the important role that standards of excellence play in defining practices. But what do we mean by standards of excellence? We can divide standards of excellence roughly into two types: virtues and norms. Virtues generally deal with the character of a person who is good at a practice. In many practices, it's important for members of that practice to strive for truth and honesty in what they say and do, justice in their dealings with other members of the practice and those outside the practice, and courage to stand up for what they think is best in a practice. To see why these virtues are often important in practices, let's consider a practice like soccer. In soccer, players who fall short of the virtues of the sport often do so by cheating, and they can cheat by being dishonest, such as pretending to have an injury in order to get a penalty kick, or they can also cheat by acting unjustly towards other players, such as trying to injure a good player on the opposing team. On the other hand, a soccer player might not cheat, but still might not be a good player because they lack courage. For example, a player might be so afraid of failure that they do not take shots at the goal, keeping them from growing in the sport. Another type of set of standards of excellence are norms, which refer to conventions or what is typically thought or done in a practice. There are many types of norms in a practice, such as principles, procedures, dispositions, goals, genres, and discourses. Let's look at a few examples of norms by returning to the example of soccer. One simple example of principles in soccer are the rules of the game, which may differ depending on context, such as different leagues or age groups. Good players in soccer generally need strong command of the rules of the game. An example of the discourse of soccer is the various specialized terms used to refer to specific actions in the game, such as corner kick or slide tackle. Good players of soccer generally learn the lingo in order to be able to communicate about the game efficiently with other players. Finally, an example of procedural norms in soccer include things like specific types of plays that a team may plan in practice, such as deep defenses or high presses. A good player would know how to execute a range of plays depending on specific contexts in a game. Through study and exercise of these standards of excellence, a soccer player might achieve the goods promised in the practice, such as the happiness of playing well, or winning a team victory, or the wellness of being physically fit. We can now start to see how a person might develop a commitment to certain values in the world. They might acquire them by engaging in practices and learning the standards of excellence in that practice. And by striving for these standards, people can begin to experience some of the goods that come from certain practices. And if they continue to desire to experience those goods, then they can make a commitment to grow in that practice. As many people make commitments to certain practices, multiple perspectives on the goods and standards of excellence for that practice often arise. Oftentimes, a practice can continue to thrive with multiple perspectives, but sometimes multiple perspectives lead to a breakdown of cooperation between members of a practice. In order to maintain cooperation within a practice, institutions are often created. Institutions maintain cooperation in multiple ways. They regulate practices by establishing and enforcing standards of excellence. They may also help keep the practice alive by ensuring the members of the practice have the resources like equipment and money to engage in the practice. And institutions resolve disputes regarding excellent standards of excellence in the practice. Let's return to the example of soccer. Imagine you wanted to engage in the practice of soccer. How would you do it? Well, one way is you might begin by playing soccer in your free time as a child with friends. And you might experience many different sets of norms or values as you play soccer for fun. Some friends might want to follow strict rules while others might be more relaxed about the rules. And you might play at a school playground or a vacant lot where you have to improvise boundaries of the field and the goal lines. If you wanted to make a commitment to grow in the practice of soccer, you might decide to join a soccer league. Soccer league is a good example of an institution. A league does the following things. It establishes and enforces a common set of rules of the game for that league. These rules represent a consensus among the teams in the league. It's the rules that they agree to follow as they play the game, and they agree to abide by the rulings of the game officials as they enforce those rules. A soccer league also provides resources like soccer fields and game officials to facilitate the practice of soccer. Because we engage in so many practices, we have many types of institutions to help us reach consensus on standards of excellence within practices. They span the breadth of human experience and they exist in all different kinds of societies. At this point, we can now see a bigger picture. People desire goods, which they experience through engaging in practices. The goods in a practice are achieved through observing standards of excellence in a practice, and in order to codify and enforce standards of excellence in a practice, sometimes institutions are created. And when people reach a level of personal development where they are ready to make a commitment in a relativistic world, they may do so through commitment to a practice and the values associated with that practice. But what happens when institutions clash or a member of a practice clashes with an institution? How might these disagreements be resolved? For resolving these conflicts, we might look to practices that aim to regulate institutions and other practices, a kind of meta practice. One such kind of meta practice is liberal democracy. Liberal democracy might be defined as a complex practice of conflict resolution and consensus building in a diverse world. Liberal democracy is a strategy that makes use of other practices to help resolve conflicts without violence. The key practices liberal democracies use to resolve conflict are science, government, journalism, and law. Within these practices, institutions have developed to help regulate the practices themselves. But these institutions also help resolve conflicts outside their own practices as part of doing liberal democracy. Let's look at an example of a liberal democracy, the US, resolving a disagreement within the practice of cooking through the formation of an institution called the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. Cooking is part of an interconnected web of practices, including farming and food packaging. And in the early 1900s, meat packers in Chicago were packaging diseased meat for human consumption. Investigative journalists like Upton Sinclair exposed this unsanitary practice to the public. And As a result, the US Congress passed the Pure Food and Drugs Act in 1906, which did many things, including prevent unsanitary food from being packaged. However, Congress had a problem. They did not have the expertise to set precise and accurate rules that would prevent the production of unsafe foods. So, to resolve this issue, Congress created the Food and Drug Administration to set standards of excellence for food packaging. The FDA was staffed with experts in scientific fields relevant to safe food packaging, such as chemistry and biology, and these experts reached consensus on the rules that would ensure safe food production. Finally, Congress gave the FDA the authority to codify and enforce these standards of excellence in the food packaging industry. As the previous example illustrates, institutions play key roles in regulating and resolving disputes between practices in liberal democracies. But the example does raise the question of, where do institutions like the FDA come up with these rules? And why might the members of a practice like the food packaging industry or the general public trust institutions' authority in liberal democracies? Many people trust government institutions' authority if it seems clear that the institution's regulations and claims come from the practice of science. But this just shifts the authority to another practice, and we come to the same question: why trust science? So, to answer this question, we need to understand what goods science produces, what standards of excellence are in science, and how institutions work in science. The primary good that science produces is knowledge. One way we can define knowledge is ideas that have been validated through testing. And because we live in a relativistic world, these ideas are also dependent on context. Scientific knowledge needs to be tested to be trustworthy, and this gives us a clue about some of the standards of excellence in science. Any claim in science needs to be reliable, which means that anyone in principle should be able to test the claim and get the same result. No one has personal authority in science. No one can say, "This is true because I say so." Why must a claim be tested? Because scientists generally recognize that they are fallible, which means they could be wrong. This means that no one ultimately has final say in science. The confidence that we have in claims in science is relative to the quality and amount of testing done attempting to disprove the claim. If a claim resists a lot of quality testing, we have a higher confidence that the knowledge is true. Let's look at a scientific claim. The world is round. How can we test this claim? We do this by formulating predictions about what should happen if the alternative claim is true, that is, that the Earth was flat. If a prediction based on the assumption that the Earth is flat fails, then we have more confidence that the Earth is round, or at least not flat. One prediction you might make is that if the Earth was flat, then ships sailing toward the horizon should slowly get smaller, but we should still be able to see all the parts of the ship. But what we observe is that the bottom of the hull disappears first, which suggests that the ship is moving over a curved surface. We have a lot of confidence in this claim because anyone can test its predictions and observe the same result. But few people have the time and resources to test all of these claims, so scientific institutions were created to test scientific claims and produce scientific knowledge. Some scientific institutions include universities, research institutes, and national laboratories. These institutions produce scientific knowledge claims, and then scientists share their work through other institutions like journals, conferences, and institute reports. And all of these institutions codify consensus of standards of excellence and enforce them through processes like peer review. Peer review is the process that scientific claims go through to further test them. Scientists submit articles describing their claims and the tests they ran to validate them, and then other scientists review and check those claims. Often they evaluate the reasoning of an article, and sometimes they attempt to replicate the results themselves. This process reflects the standards of excellence in science. Scientists test claims because they could be wrong, and if a scientific claim survives multiple tests, we have higher confidence that the results are reliable and true. The authority acquired by the government institutions like the FDA reflects the trust the public can have in the consensus of experts in the practice of science. These experts make claims, test them, and produce knowledge. This knowledge then informs the regulations that institutions like the FDA establish to resolve conflicts between multiple perspectives. But because people in all of these institutions could be wrong, ideas are continuously tested, and if disputes arise, revised through building a new consensus. Putting all of these pieces together, we can see that people begin from a position of dualism, pursuing good things. As they develop, they engage in practices and interact with institutions in those practices. They begin to encounter multiple perspectives as they engage in these practices. This helps them develop to understand how contexts shape our knowledge and values. And in liberal democracies, institutions in the practices of science, government, journalism, and law help us resolve disagreements among multiple perspectives. This diagram offers one perspective among many of what it is like to live in modern times. It is an idealistic version of how institutions operate in our lives. But of course, consensus is hard to achieve, and standards of excellence are not always followed or agreed on. So this diagram can also help us point out where problems arise in our lives. My hope is that the diagram can serve as a map for you to navigate your life and give you the tools to figure out your own commitments. Thanks for watching.